Reading poetry is awesome.
Writing poetry is awesomer. Stick around to find out more about how to read poetry
And how to take your poetry writing from meh to magnificent.
M. Norbise Philip is a writer who was born in Tobago in 1947. She moved to Canada for university and settled there, becoming a lawyer before she took up writing full-time. Philip has published 5 books of poetry and also writes fiction, essays, and drama. One of Norbise Philip's most famous books is a found poem called Zong. A found poem takes its poetry from an existing document, or a letter, or a magazine article. Remember that Philip was a lawyer? Zong is based on historic legal documents from a real case. In the 1700s, the English crew of a slave ship called the Zong massacred between 130 to 150 enslaved African men, women, and children by throwing them overboard just to collect the insurance money. The Africans were insured as property, not passengers. Each one the crew threw overboard was valued at the equivalent of over $6,000 a piece in today's money. That's hard to read, and not just because of the topic. Philip lays the poem out on the page with huge gaps between words and phrases. One reviewer, Helen Conaris, said about Zong,
"The letters far from each other sound like voices calling out from the water, like voices mourning. There's a sense in which words are not the thing here, that words must get out of the way for something else to come through. White space fills these pages like water."
Norbise Philip experiments a lot with form and language in her poetry. You can also see it in her other most famous poem, Discourse on the Logic of Language.
"I have a dumb tongue. Tongue dumb, father tongue, and English is my mother tongue, is my father tongue, is a foreign language, a languish, anguish, a foreign anguish."
M. Norbise Philip's poetry asks questions about race, gender, and identity, and how those things connect to language. When you're writing a literature exam, you're 100% guaranteed to get a question on theme. The theme of a work of art is the main idea that it's trying to show. A poem may be about many different things, but a good poem often has a big idea at the heart of it. It may be something like the healing qualities of love, the pain of loss, nature's beauty, faith in humanity, the joys of fatherhood, etc., etc. A poem can be about literally any theme. There's no formula really. Your understanding of the theme or topic comes from your understanding of the poem. When you identify the theme, you show that you really get the poem. But how do you do that? A good place to start is by reading the poem. To help us talk about theme, let's call on 19th century US poet Emily Dickinson and her poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death.
"Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality."
Maybe this one's too easy. I mean, the theme is right there in the title, isn't it? It's a poem about death. Obvi. The images Dickinson uses are things that are fleeting, like children playing at recess, and things that are dying or already dead. Grain in a field, soon to be harvested, and a mash-up old house with parts of the top of the building down on the ground. Duh, death. Well, yeah, but also no. Sure, the poem is about death, but what about death? Dig deeper. It's the narrator's attitude towards death that's the real theme, not just death in general. You have to take the poem as a whole, and also consider the poem's tone and mood. Tone and mood say what now? Your granny ever tell you it's not what you say, but how you say it? Tone is the emotional value the poet puts into the poem. In talking about a poem's tone, you might use words like bitter, ironic, frustrated, joyful, inspirational, or hopeful, for example. The tone is how the poet feels about the topic. Mood is what the poem makes the reader feel. The emotional effect of reading a poem, that's one of the things that poetry does best. And that's how you can identify the mood of the poem. How does "Because I Could Not Stop for Death" make you feel about death? Scared? Angry? Hopeful? Chill? In this poem, Dickinson uses a lot of imagery. The first image, of course, is the personified death. Instead of making death an abstract idea, Dickinson makes him a guy who picks up the narrator in a carriage and slowly drives her through town. The two of them rolling, looking at stuff, kids fighting at recess, fields of grain, the setting sun, a derelict house. The narrator says it's chilly, and she's only wearing clothes made out of gossamer and tulle, both thin, cobwebby kinds of cloth. Who goes for a carriage ride with death, unless they're dead and in a hearse? Oh wait, was that house a grave? Plot twist. Dun dun dun! But the narrator doesn't sound angry about being dead at all. She's pretty chill and even uses words like kindly and civility in talking about her driver, Death. And now, back to our regular programming. The imagery in this Dickinson poem points to death being inevitable, unescapable. Even if you don't stop for him, he'll stop for you. Bet. Dickinson isn't protesting or arguing with death. Her tone is very chill. The mood of the poem is accepting. When you put the pieces all together, you could say that the poem's theme is acceptance of the inevitability of death. Ta-da!
The sun works for the tourist board was a bad joke. But now each noon the sun toils like a fisherman with a hard tide to beat, or a farmer whose wife will drop soon.
That's the opening stanza of The Tourists by Trinidadian poet Wayne Brown. Let's follow the clues to see if we can find out about this poem's theme. This poem describes a scene on a Caribbean beach, with white tourists on vacation sunning their buns on the sand and spearfishing in the reef. The sunbathing strangers mentioned in the second stanza and the English anthropologists in the third are doing no work. In contrast, the sun is working desperately hard. The narrator compares the sun to a fisherman or a farmer, the people who actually live in the place. The poet's ironic tone mocks the vacationers and their fake tourist brochure experience of the Caribbean. In the last stanza, the narrator describes what it's like for a parrotfish who's been killed with a spear, presumably by a tourist. The poet shows how the dying fish turns grave somersaults on the steel hunting weapon. In the last line, the poet likens the fish to the sun. Both were supposed to just swim through blue air in silence, but the spear has usurped that purpose. The poem's mood is bitter. The irony expresses the bitterness the narrator feels to see the Caribbean being reduced to an exotic fantasy destination. You could say that the theme of the poem is how tourism destroys Caribbean life. In both Because I Could Not Stop for Death and The Tourists, The poets use the device of personification. Personification is when you give human qualities to a non-human thing, like death, or the sun, or the felines in Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot. Write a poem where you personify an emotion, a non-living thing, or an animal. You can even write it from the perspective of the thing being personified. Try it.